But was it really the power of witchcraft that turned this town upside down? It's so terrifying, no one could have guessed. Imagine this. You receive a court summons because someone you know suddenly falls ill with a mysterious, medically unexplained condition. Obviously, that must mean you're a witch. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 were one of the darkest chapters in American history. When a strange illness appeared in a small village, the people of Salem grew suspicious and believed witchcraft was to blame. This led to accusations, slander, and ultimately, public hangings of many townspeople. But was it really witchcraft that caused all the chaos? What sins did these people commit? And were those who were executed truly witches? Tonight, we're diving into the crazy history of the Salem Witch Trials. The town of Salem is located in Essex County, Massachusetts, in the United States. Back then, it was a newly established town, first settled in 1629. Before that, the area was just barren land. By the 1690s, Salem had become home to a group of people known as the Puritans. The Puritans were a deeply religious community with very strict practices. They were English Protestants who sought to purify the church of what they saw as lingering Catholic influences. In the 1600s, what is now the United States was still made up of English colonies. In 1641, English colonial law was established, and one of its provisions declared all forms of witchcraft illegal. It was considered a serious offense. In fact, they even had a Witchcraft Act, created in 1604, which stated that a person convicted of minor witchcraft offenses could be imprisoned for 1 year. However, if found guilty a second time, they would face capital punishment. Interestingly, under English tradition, a confession, especially one supported by additional evidence and testimony from 2 credible witnesses, was considered legitimate proof. So, if someone accused you in court and 2 people testified against you, that was enough to get you convicted. Fast forward to 1688, there was a woman named Martha Goodwin, who had a dispute with a laundress named Goody Ann Glover. After their argument, something strange happened. Martha suddenly fell ill with bizarre symptoms that no one could explain. Martha began screaming, having seizures, and exhibiting other unusual behaviors. This mysterious illness also spread to her 2 siblings. The story of Martha's illness began circulating among the people of Salem. At that time, the townspeople believed the most logical explanation was that Martha had been bewitched, cursed, or hexed by someone. When asked who she had recently had problems with, the name Goody Ann Glover came up. Goody Ann Glover was reported to the authorities and soon arrested. She was pressured to confess that she had used witchcraft to harm Martha and her siblings. Goody was threatened. If you don't confess, you'll be hanged. Out of fear, Goody confessed, hoping that admitting guilt would spare her life or result in imprisonment. But instead, Goody was executed. 4 years later, in the winter of February 1692, a similar incident occurred. This time, the victims were 2 young girls, the daughter and niece of a minister named Samuel Parris. The girls were Betty, 9 years old, and her cousin Abigail, 11 years old. One day, Reverend Samuel left Betty and Abigail at home alone. However, they weren't completely alone. At the time, slavery still existed in America, and Reverend Samuel owned an enslaved woman of African descent named Tituba. So, Betty and Abigail were actually being looked after by Tituba. Out of boredom, Tituba decided to play with them. But within the strict and deeply religious Puritan society, children were forbidden from playing. They were expected to avoid all forms of fun or entertainment. So, they say that back then, Salem was like the quietest place ever. No music, no parades, no Saturday night performances, no night markets, and no cafe singers. In short, the town was completely dull, Because the kids were bored, Tituba suggested playing a game called Venus Glass. In this game, they would take egg whites and drop them into a glass of water. The egg whites would then move around in the water, forming shapes. The game was to interpret those shapes, which were believed to reveal their future, like who they would marry or even their fate. While playing Venus Glass with Betty and Abigail, they noticed that the shape in the glass looked like something terrifying. According to them, it resembled a coffin. Not long after playing the game with Tituba, in the middle of the freezing winter in Salem, Betty and Abigail suddenly fell ill, just like Martha Goodwin had years earlier. They started having seizures, screaming, throwing things, making strange noises, and even crawling on the floor. On top of that, they often complained, saying, "My body hurts, like I'm being pricked with needles." A doctor, Dr. William Griggs, was called to examine them. After checking the girls, he admitted that he had no idea what was wrong with them. The illness didn't stop with Betty and Abigail. Soon after, another girl, Ann Putnam Jr., and several other young girls started experiencing the same strange symptoms. Eventually, the townspeople decided that the children must be victims of witchcraft. As more kids fell ill with this unexplainable condition, the issue escalated to the courts. This marked the beginning of the Salem Witch Trials. So, how did the trials work? If someone experienced an unexplained death or illness, or if someone was acting strange in a way that even doctors couldn't explain, people would immediately report it to the local judge. If the judge found the complaint credible, they would issue an arrest warrant for the accused. The accused would then undergo a public examination, a highly pressured interrogation designed to force them to confess to being a witch. The case would then be referred to a higher court, where witnesses were called to testify before a grand jury. The first accused person was none other than Tituba. Apart from playing Venus Glass with Betty and Abigail, some townspeople claimed to have seen her giving her dog a strange treat called a witch cake. Tituba was brought to court. During questioning about Betty and Abigail, she was interrogated. "Are you a witch? Did you curse Betty and Abigail?" She was bombarded with countless questions to force her into confessing her guilt. One of the defining aspects of the Salem Witch Trials was this: if you confessed, you might receive leniency or even be pardoned. However, if you insisted on your innocence, claiming you weren't a witch and had nothing to do with witchcraft, you were far more likely to be executed. In court, Tituba ultimately confessed, saying, "Yes, I am a witch, and I cursed Betty and Abigail." She was then thrown into prison. But can you imagine how terrifying this was? It was like a no-win situation. If you confessed, you might get a lighter sentence. But, as in the case of Goody Glover, even confessing didn't guarantee your survival. From there, chaos erupted in Salem. Suddenly, dozens of people were being accused of witchcraft. And these weren't just accusations, they were actually brought to trial. People could be accused for something as arbitrary as not appearing religious enough. Take Sarah Osborne, for example. She was accused simply because she rarely attended church. The accusers could make up charges as they pleased, with little to no evidence. You can just imagine how rules like these truly tested human greed and ego. Back then, if you were annoyed with someone, didn't like how your neighbors treated you, or wondered why someone was so wealthy without appearing to work, you could accuse them of being a witch and take it to court. Anyone accused of witchcraft would be brought to court, interrogated for days, found guilty, and thrown into prison. Eventually, on June 2, 1692, the trials began, presided over by Chief Judge William Stoughton. Imagine this. One of the people brought to trial was Bridget Bishop. Why was she accused of being a witch? Bridget was seen as not following the Puritan way of life because she liked wearing black clothing and unconventional outfits. For instance, one of the key pieces of evidence against her was that she modified her coat by cutting it in half before the trial. This was considered immoral behavior and proof that she was a witch. Because of this, Bridget was tried, found guilty on the same day, and executed by hanging on June 10, 1692, all because she wore black clothing. After Bridget's execution, the trials were paused briefly to seek advice from influential figures in New England. But nothing changed. Between June 30th and early July, the grand jury handed down guilty verdicts for yet women. On July 19th, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds, and Rebecca Nurse were hanged. A month later, 5 more were executed, and the following month, the grand jury issued 18 more indictments. On September 19, 1692, there was a male defendant, a rarity in the Salem Witch Trials, where most of the accused were women. This time, the accused was a man named Giles Corey. As usual, Giles was asked in court to confess to being a witch, but he refused, saying, "I am not a witch. I've never practiced witchcraft. I don't even understand why I'm being accused." Because Giles stood firm in his denial, the court decided he needed a different form of pressure. He was sentenced to peine forte et dure, a brutal form of torture where the accused was pressed under increasingly heavy stones until they confessed. Despite the excruciating torture, Giles Corey refused to confess and died 2 days later. Historically, at least 172 people were accused of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials. Of those, 19 were executed by hanging, and one, Giles Corey, was pressed to death. Interestingly, Tituba, the enslaved woman who worked for Reverend Sam and was the first to be accused, was eventually pardoned, along with others who were found not guilty or released on bail. Ironically, Tituba's case was what triggered the entire Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Trials were horrifying in their arbitrariness. The line between guilty and not guilty was impossible to predict, entirely dependent on the judge's decisions. The biggest question remains: what actually happened to the children in Salem at the time? What was this mysterious illness they suffered from? That unexplained condition was the spark that ignited the tragic loss of so many lives during the Salem Witch Trials. For decades, it remained an unsolved mystery. Many believed that actual witches lived in Salem at the time, using their powers to harm others. Even today, some still believe that a few of the accused during the Salem Witch Trials were real witches. Salem has since been branded as the Witch City, and even turned into a popular destination for witchcraft-themed tourism. However, decades after the trials, modern scientific researchers proposed an alternative explanation. They suggest that the strange behaviors of Martha, Betty, Abigail, and the other children might have been caused by a toxic fungus they consumed, Claviceps purpurea, also known as ergot. This natural fungus is known to affect behavior and produce symptoms similar to what the children in Salem experienced. Claviceps purpurea, the fungus that is the natural source of LSD, can grow on grains during the winter. This fungus is known to cause symptoms like choking, vomiting, and even hallucinations. Interestingly, this same fungus is also believed to explain other strange historical phenomena, such as the dancing plague of 1518, when an entire village suddenly couldn't stop dancing. In addition to consuming the fungus, modern researchers suggest that the children in Salem at the time may have suffered from Lyme disease, epilepsy, or even psychological stress brought on by their strict religious environment, which opposed anything remotely enjoyable. This could have contributed to their strange behavior. The Salem Witch Trials sparked massive controversy. How could people accused without clear evidence or a strong basis end up being publicly executed? When people began to investigate, they asked, where did this all begin? It turns out that 2 families in Salem at the time, the Porters and the Putnams, were feuding. The Putnams were conservative farmers, while the Porters ran a sawmill and held more liberal views. In 1672, the Porters Dam broke and flooded the Putnams' farmland. The Putnams sued the Porters for damages, escalating tensions between the two families. Given the importance of farmland and crops during that era, the conflict was serious. Some believe the Putnams exploited the legal system of the time to eliminate their rivals. In fact, 8 members of the Putnam family were directly involved as accusers, or part of the teams prosecuting the alleged witches. According to Britannica.com, many of those accused and executed were people who had disputes or conflicts with the Putnam family. After the wave of executions ended in September 1692, reports of children falling ill began to decline, perhaps because the seasons were changing. At the same time, townspeople started questioning the trials. Fear spread. What if tomorrow someone accuses me? Suspicion also grew because many accusers and witnesses were family members or relatives of the jurors deciding the cases. Finally, in 1693, the Salem Witch Trials came to an end. The remaining prisoners were released, and all charges against them were dropped. The General Court of Salem even issued an apology and offered reparations to the victims' families. And so, the dark chapter of the Salem Witch Trials closed. 300 years later, a memorial was erected to honor those who lost their lives due to accusations of witchcraft. Today, the Salem Witch Trials are considered one of the darkest periods in American history. Ironically, though, Salem has become a popular tourist destination thanks to its grim past. And that's the story. Just a quick reminder. This happened around 332 years ago, at a time when anything unexplainable in the U.S. was often blamed on witchcraft. Thanks to advancements in science, medicine, and technology, in 2024, we can often find logical explanations for mysterious events or illnesses. With the right research, many mysteries can be solved. But let me ask you this. Do you believe the events in Salem were proof of real witchcraft? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Are you wearing black right now? Are you a witch? Let me know below. And I've got one last question. Is there a phenomenon you've encountered that even after looking for a logical explanation, still feels unexplainable or connected to the supernatural? Share your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear about your experiences or anything you've heard. Also, let me know what other exciting topics you'd like us to cover in future videos. Don't forget to subscribe, because I can't wait to see you all again. Bye.